Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to speak on Bill S-224, an act to amend the Criminal Code, Trafficking in Persons. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin people. This bill came to us, Madam Speaker, on October the 18th after having passed in the other place, and proposes reforms to the definition of exploitation for the purposes of the Criminal Code's human trafficking offences. This bill seeks to protect victims and to hold human traffickers accountable. These are laudable and pressing objectives, Madam Speaker. Human trafficking is one of the most heinous crimes imaginable and is often described as a modern-day form of slavery. It involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, and/or control over the movement of persons for the purpose of exploitation, typically for sexual exploitation or forced labor. Human trafficking devastates victims and survivors, their families, communities, and society as a whole. In Canada, reported human trafficking data primarily relates to trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation. Traffickers seek to profit off the sexual exploitation of others, treating victims as commodities for the traffickers' financial gain. Between 2010 and 2021, the large majority of individuals accused of trafficking were men who were most commonly between the ages of 18 to 24. While we know that anyone can be targeted by a trafficker and become a victim of human trafficking, between 2010 and 2021, 96% of police reported victims were women and girls. Almost 1 in 4, or 24% of the reported victims, were younger than the age of 18. Half, 45%, were between 18 to 24 years old, and 1 in 5 were between the ages of 25 and 34 years old. Moreover, women and girls are more at risk of being targeted by a trafficker when they are impacted by factors like poverty, isolation, precarious housing, substance use, history of violence, childhood maltreatment, and mental health issues, Madam Speaker. In short, traffickers look for young women and girls in precarious situations and target these individuals for their own financial gain. Nous savons également que le
We also know that women, Indigenous women and girls, are overrepresented among victims, and they are at risk of being victims for the purposes of sexual exploitation. The results of the inquiry point out a number of factors that increase the probability of recidivism and violence towards women and intergenerational trauma related to colonization and the lack of social and economic resources and colonial assimilation practices.
Likely target victims who experience these type of risk factors. The majority of victims are trafficked by someone they know. For example, nearly 1/3 of victims have been trafficked by a current or former intimate partner. In fact, some traffickers target and romantically pursue a potential victim with the specific intent of exploiting them. Traffickers will go to great extents to keep victims isolated and unable to seek help. Traffickers often separate victims from those who could help them, hiding them from the public and ensuring they did not have access to support. They may force victims to commit crimes while being trafficked, convincing them, victim, that they will be arrested if they try to seek help. We also know that victims may unwillingly or unable to seek help for a number of reasons, such as distrust of authorities, which is often created or fostered by traffickers themselves, or because victims are fearful or ashamed, aren't aware of their rights in Canada, experience language barriers, or desire to protect their trafficker. After being trafficked, victims may experience post-traumatic stress and memory loss as a result of the physical, sexual, financial, emotional, and psychological abuse they are subject to while being trafficked. Many victims live both physical and psychological scars from being trafficked. Il est primordial.
It is paramount that victims be supported and their traffickers brought to justice. I'm reassured by the fact that the Criminal Code contains a robust legislative framework governing human trafficking, which includes specific human trafficking offenses. Such offenses include trafficking in adults, child trafficking, materially benefiting from human trafficking, and withholding or destroying identity documents to facilitate this crime, with maximum penalties ranging up to life imprisonment. As human trafficking cases are complex, additional offenses may be used depending on the facts, and those additional offenses include things such as uttering threats, forcible confinement, assault, and sexual assault.
4, Madam Speaker, strengthens this framework. I agree with the bill's sponsor that we must continue to reflect on how we can ensure that the most robust legislative framework possible, and I'm grateful that we now have the opportunity to do just that. That brings me to my main concern with Bill S-224. The bill would repeal the Criminal Code's existing definition of exploitation, resulting in prosecutors no longer being able to rely on that definition in appropriate cases. The current definition of exploitation focuses on the impact of the trafficker's conduct on a reasonable person in the victim's circumstances. I note that the existing definition was first enacted in 2005, and such that now we have 17 years of jurisprudence interpreting it. I'm pleased to be able to report that the definition has been interpreted broadly, as I have already noted, applied to human trafficking cases that have involved purely psychological forms of coercion. This is critically important because human traffickers often target victims due to their vulnerabilities, which make them easy to manipulate without the need to resort to more violent tactics. In particular, both the Ontario and Quebec courts of appeal have found under such existing approach, prosecutors do not need to prove that the victim was actually afraid, that the accused used or threatened the use of physical violence, or even that exploitation actually occurred. Prosecutors need to only prove that a reasonable person in the victim's circumstances would fear for their safety, that the accused engaged in psychological forms of coercion, and that the accused either intended to exploit the victim or knew that someone else intended to do so. If Bill S-224 were amended to add its proposed definition of exploitation as an additional definition that could be used in appropriate cases, prosecutors would have an additional tool to assist ensuring that traffickers are held to account. Such an approach would strengthen the existing criminal law's response to human trafficking without removing any of the existing tools that have been successful in achieving the critical objective of ending this heinous crime. Since 2005, when human trafficking offences were enacted in the Criminal Code, Canada has continued to demonstrate leadership in combating human trafficking. For example, Madam Speaker, in 2019, the Government of Canada launched the National Strategy to Combat Human Trafficking. The strategy is led by Public Safety Canada and is a 5-year whole-of-government approach to address human trafficking. It frames federal activities under the internationally recognized pillars of prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. Madam Speaker, the objectives of S-224 are laudable, and I share the sponsor's concern about the serious impacts human trafficking has on victims, and I welcome the opportunity to study the bill, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Prise de débat.